very much, Madam President. This country has gone through over 2 weeks of very difficult times. It is extremely distressful that approximately 1 million federal employees have not received a paycheck. And these federal employees have gone 3 years without a raise. They have been furloughed because of sequestration. And now they have been sent home in many cases without any pay. And like every other American, every other working American, these are people who are worried as to how they're going to pay their mortgages, how they're going to pay their car loans, how they're going to pay their college loans, and they are extremely anxious. But it is not only the million or so federal employees who are hurting. Obviously, it is the tens of millions of Americans today who are in enormous anxiety about whether or not they're going to get the federal benefits that they are entitled to and the federal services that they need. I am talking now as chairman of the Senate Veterans Committee about veterans who have written to me from Vermont and elsewhere who are worried that they may not get their veterans disability benefit. Just think about that. People who have put their lives on the line for this country were wounded in action, and they're sitting home wondering whether they're going to get a check which they desperately need in order to keep their family going. I'm talking now about people on Social Security who are wondering that if this government actually defaults and for the first time in our history does not pay our bills, that they may not get a Social Security check. And millions of seniors depend on that Social Security check in order to pay their bills and to maintain a very minimal standard of living. And I'm talking about, moms who today are walking their kids into the Head Start program and then going off to work. And they're worried about what happens if that Head Start program is shut down. What does that mean to their child? What does it mean to them? How do they get to work? Who's going to take care of their kid? Are they going to lose their job? So what has happened in the last few weeks has brought a whole lot of anxiety and pain to tens and tens of millions of Americans. And why? Because over in the House we had a handful of right-wing extremists who've decided that they were going to hold hostage the American government unless they were able to defund Obamacare. That was last week. And then more recently, they were going to hold the government hostage unless we made major cuts in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and that was a few days ago. So I think what has happened has been incredibly unfortunate to our country. The damage done in terms of our position in the international community will take many, many years to overcome. What do you think the international community, people in Latin America, people in Europe, people in Asia believe when they say the United States, the largest economy on earth, presumably the leader of the free world, and this government is shut down, and this country is debating whether or not we pay our bills? How does the President of the United States go to the United Nations, go to the world community and say, listen, there's an international crisis, you need to follow our lead, and we are the country that can't even pay its bills, or is threatening not to pay its bills for the last couple of weeks, and has shut down the entire United States government? So the damage already done by right-wing extremism is irreparable. I think people's confidence in the United States government has been shattered. I am thinking, Madam President, about kids in Wisconsin or kids in Vermont who are now looking at the United States government as some kind of joke, where maybe at some point they were thinking of running for office, getting involved in the political process, and now they're saying, it's not something that I want to do. It's not something that I want to do. And that is very, very sad. Now, I intend to vote for the agreement hammered out by the majority leader and the minority leader. But I want to make something very, very clear. If anybody thinks that this sequestration budget is a good thing for America, they are very, very mistaken. Now, as I understand it, the sequestration will be extended until January 15th. Now, we don't know what happens after that. Presumably that's going to be based on negotiations. But according to the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, if in fact, and I will do everything in my power to see that that does not happen, but if the $988 billion sequestration budget were to go throughout this year, it would cost us some 900,000 jobs. Now, I have heard many of my Republican friends, and perhaps some Democrats, making the point, and an important point, that we have got to do something about the budget deficit, and we have to do something about our national debt. I agree with that. And I'm proud that along with other members, we have cut the deficit in half from $1.4 trillion to $700 billion. Anyone who doesn't think that that's progress, I think is very wrong. Cutting the budget deficit in half is significant progress. But, Madam President, let me make a point that is not made terribly often here on this floor. Yes, the deficit is a serious problem. Yes, we've got to work on it. But every poll that I have seen, and in my discussions with people in Vermont, they say, yeah, the deficit is a serious problem. Do something about it. But let me tell you, Senator Sanders, what's a more serious problem? And that is that the middle class of this country is disappearing. Median family income is lower today than it was 24 years ago. Real unemployment is close to 14%. Youth unemployment is somewhere around 20%. African American youth unemployment is somewhere around 40%. And what the people of America are saying, do something about the economy. Make sure that when my kid graduates high school, there will be a job available for him or her. Do something about the high cost of college education, because I don't want my son or daughter to be leaving school $25,000 or $50,000 in debt. Make sure, they tell me, that you don't cut Social Security, because Social Security is one of the few bedrocks remaining to protect some of the most vulnerable people in this country. Make sure you don't voucherize Medicare, as the Ryan budget in the House proposed, end Medicare as we know it, and give senior citizens an $8,000 check, and when they get diagnosed with cancer, good luck to them, because that $8,000 will last 2 or 3 days. Make sure you don't slash Medicaid. So, Madam President, the important point that has to be made is deficit reduction is an issue. But the more important issue that the American people want us to resolve is to create the millions and millions of jobs this country desperately needs. And the sequestration budget that we're voting on today moves us in exactly the wrong direction. If that budget were to go on for a year, right now it's scheduled to end at January 15th, but if that would go on for a year, it would cost us 900,000 jobs rather than growing the many, many millions of jobs that we currently need. And, Madam President, let me again raise an issue that many of my colleagues do not talk about, but I think the American people understand. At a time when we have more income and wealth inequality in this country than since the 1920s, what morality demands, and in fact what good economics demands, is you don't balance the budget on the backs of the elderly, the children, working families, the poor. But I don't hear much of that discussion here. Now, if you have a situation in America where the top 1% owns 38% of the wealth and the bottom 60% owns 2.3% of the wealth, who should have to experience austerity? Should we go to working families who in many cases have seen a decline in their income and say, guess what? We're going to have to balance the budget on your backs. We're going to have to cut Medicare, cut Medicaid, cut nutrition programs, cut the ability of your kid to go to college, because we need to balance the budget. And guess what? The rich and the powerful have too many lobbyists here, and so we're going to have to cut programs that impact you. Well, I know that many people here in the Senate want to move in that direction. I do not. Not only do we have an obscene, unfair distribution of wealth, it is as bad when we talk about income inequality. Madam President, you have seen, I know, the same studies that I have seen, which talk about how in the last few years, 95% of all new income generated in this country went to the top 1%. 95% of all new income went to the top 1%, while tens of millions of other Americans saw a decline in their income. Now, Madam President, if in...
The senator has used 10 minutes.
I would ask unanimous consent for 2 more minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, I think if you had a discussion in some diner in Wisconsin, or I did the same in Vermont, and you talked to people and said, look, the wealthiest people are becoming much richer, middle class is declining, poverty is at an all-time high, how do you think we should deal with deficit reduction? You really think we should be cutting programs for the elderly, working families, the children, the sick, or the poor? Or maybe do we ask the wealthiest people in this country to start paying their fair share of taxes? Maybe, Madam President, I know this is just a terribly radical idea. Today, 1 out of 4 major corporations pays 0 in federal income tax, because a lot of these multinational corporations are stashing their money in the Cayman Islands and in Bermuda and in other tax havens. Now, I know it's a very radical idea. I guess I'm an extremist for thinking maybe it is more important for corporate America that is enjoying record-breaking profits. 1 out of 4 major corporations pays nothing in federal income taxes. Maybe we might want to ask them to pay something in taxes so that we don't cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, and nutrition programs. Now, I think what goes on around here is our sense of reality is distorted, because surrounding this building are not working families. They're too busy back home trying to maintain their families. Not children, and we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. They're not here. But all of the lobbyists from the billionaire organizations and for corporate America, they're here telling us what we should be doing. Well, I think maybe the time is long overdue that we stood up for the working families of this country, for the children and for the elderly, and not move to a deficit reduction on the backs of the most vulnerable people. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam President. I come to the floor, first of all, I've come to the floor a number of times during this government shutdown just to say how absurd this has been for the American people.